I once sat through a church history lecture where the professor explained the Council of Nicaea as a clean, decisive moment. 300 bishops, one emperor, one creed. Christianity unified, heresy stamped out, everyone goes home. It was a tidy story. I remember writing it down word for word and feeling oddly suspicious. The way you feel when someone tells you a divorce was entirely mutual. But that clean story? It fell apart the moment I learned about Constantia. Constantine had her husband executed. A few months later, her son too. Then, he invited her to come live at his court, and she came. What Constantia did next didn't make it into most history books. But it kept a condemned heresy breathing for 50 more years, unraveled the most important church council in history, and shaped the Christianity that billions of people practice today. And she did it from her deathbed. The story of Nicaea and the Arian controversy doesn't end at Nicaea. It barely even pauses there. One of the main reasons the supposedly dead heresy kept breathing for another 50+ years, the reason bishops got exiled, reinstated, exiled again, the reason Arius himself came within hours of walking back into the church in triumph was a woman most history books don't give 3 sentences to. Her name was Constantia, Constantine's half-sister. And she may have done more to keep Arianism alive than any bishop who ever preached it from a pulpit. Let's start with who she actually was, because the setup matters. Constantia was born sometime after 293. Her father was Constantius Chlorus, who ran the western half of the Roman Empire, and her mother was Theodora, making her Constantine's half-sister, though ancient sources often blur that distinction. Constantine's mother was Helena, the pilgrimage-making empress everyone knows. Constantia's mother was Theodora. Same father, different mother, same dynasty. She had 2 full brothers of her own, Flavius Dalmatius and Julius Constantius, but neither of them came close to Constantine's power. Constantia spent her entire life standing next to the most powerful man in the world, while technically being a secondary figure. In 313, Constantine gave her in marriage to Licinius. She was at most 18 years old. Licinius was more than twice her age and had been a soldier since before she was born. This was not a love match. It was a political arrangement, sealed at their famous meeting in Milan, the same meeting that produced the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire. Constantia's wedding was essentially the price tag on a geopolitical ceasefire. The marriage placed her in Nicomedia, one of the main imperial capitals of the East. And Nicomedia was exactly where an ambitious bishop named Eusebius had recently managed to relocate himself, despite a canonical rule explicitly forbidding bishops from moving between the official jurisdiction or diocese without permission. He had originally been bishop of Berytus, which is modern Beirut, perfectly respectable, but Nicomedia was where the emperor lived. So Eusebius engineered a transfer, settled in, and made himself indispensable to the imperial household. By the time Constantia arrived as Licinius's wife, Eusebius of Nicomedia was already in high favor with her. This was not the famous Eusebius of Caesarea, the church historian. This was the other one, the political operator, and the distinction matters enormously. He had trained under Lucian of Antioch, a scholar whose school produced a whole generation of clergy who would later be called Arians. Eusebius was a supporter, ally, and eventually one of the primary architects of the position Arius would make famous, that the Son of God was a created being, subordinate to the Father, not co-eternal with him. The Nicene formula insisted Christ was homoousios, of the same substance as the Father. Arius denied it. There was a time when the Son was not. That was the formula. Eusebius believed it, and from the very beginning of her marriage, Constantia was surrounded by people who did too. The prominence Eusebius held at Licinius's court was, by most historical accounts, substantially due to Constantia. She liked him. She trusted him. She found his arguments persuasive. That wasn't incidental background detail, it was the precondition for everything that followed. Now here is where the story gets genuinely painful. In 316, war broke out between Constantine and Licinius. Constantine won the first round. A peace was negotiated. Constantia stayed at her husband's side. She had already borne Licinius, a son, Valerius Licinianus, Licinius, usually called Licinius the Younger, in 315. A second war erupted in 324. Constantine won again, decisively, at Adrianople in July, and at Chrysopolis in September. Licinius surrendered. Constantia personally interceded with Constantine to spare her husband's life. Constantine agreed. Licinius was sent to Thessalonica as a private citizen. Several months later, in the spring of 325, Constantine had him executed anyway on the allegation that he was plotting to retake power. Shortly after that, he had Licinius the Younger executed as well. Constantia's husband, her son, both dead within a year of each other by her brother's order. She went to live at Constantine's court. What that arrangement felt like internally, whether there was grief or fury or a very carefully managed numbness, the sources don't say. What they say is that she was treated with honor. Constantine minted coins with her image, and the inscription Constantia Soror Constantini AVG. Constantia, sister of Constantine Augustus. She was his favorite sister. He made sure everyone could read it on their spare change. She was also a woman who had just watched her brother order the murder of her husband and son. It was into that specific emotional landscape, widowed, grieving, politically marginal, but personally beloved, still trusted by the man who had just destroyed her family, that Arianism walked, in the form of a priest. The Council of Nicaea happened in 325, the same year Licinius was killed. Constantia reportedly attended, and there she reportedly advised the Arian bishops present, Eusebius of Nicomedia, Maris of Chalcedon, and Theognis of Nicaea, to sign the Nicene Creed and avoid condemnation. She wasn't arguing theology from the floor. She was giving political survival counsel to the losing faction, helping them get through the council without being permanently destroyed by it. They signed. They avoided the worst, for the moment. Within months of Nicaea, Constantine exiled Eusebius of Nicomedia and Theognis of Nicaea anyway, not for theology, but for political reasons, accusing them of having supported Licinius and sent spies against him. He exiled Arius too. The council's verdict stood on paper. The heresy's main architects were gone. Orthodoxy, as defined at Nicaea, was supposed to be the final answer. Here is where Constantia becomes something more than a background figure. By 328, 3 years after Nicaea, 3 years after Licinius's death, Eusebius of Nicomedia was back from exile. Arius was recalled. The man who had been expelled for challenging the entire Nicene formula was returning to the imperial orbit. Most ancient sources attribute this reversal, at least in part, to Constantia. She had convinced Constantine to recall them, or she had created the conditions under which the recall became possible. The Catholic Encyclopedia is direct about it. It was Constantia, the widow of Licinius, who induced Constantine to recall Arius, and that she was probably also the cause of Eusebius's return. But the deeper story, the one recorded in an anonymous church history preserved online at 4thcentury.com, written almost certainly in the 4th century itself, is about what happened in the final months of her life. According to that source, Constantia encountered a priest named Eutychius, a supporter of Arius. At first he made contact with her servants, working his way up through the household staff before ever meeting her directly, which is a very recognizable kind of access seeking. Eventually he reached Constantia herself. He was, the text notes, a superb flatterer. He told her the entire dispute over Arius had been driven by envy, that Arius actually taught the same things as Alexander of Alexandria, his original opponent, and that Alexander had opposed him not for theology but out of jealousy over Arius's popularity with ordinary people. This was not true, but it was an argument tailored precisely for someone who wanted to believe it. Constantia had personal reasons to distrust official condemnations. She had watched her husband's reputation be carefully managed right up until the moment Constantine ordered his execution. The idea that a man's downfall might be driven by politics and jealousy rather than genuine wrongdoing was not a hard sell for a woman who had lived through exactly that. She believed Eutychius. She made him one of her closest friends. And then she got sick. Constantine came to her immediately. She was dying, and this was his favorite sister. After a long conversation, she made one final request. "Do me one favor, praiseworthy emperor, for I am going away to be with God." She asked him to release Arius from exile to undo what she called an injustice inflicted on an innocent man through intrigue. The anonymous historian says Constantine listened patiently, assuming she was asking from genuine sisterly concern, not understanding she had spent months being shaped by Eutychius's arguments. He granted her request. Arius's exile was lifted. Here's the part most people never hear. On her deathbed, Constantia didn't just ask Constantine to free Arius. She recommended Eutychius to him personally. As one who has experienced his uprightness, I recommend him to you, pious emperor. Constantine, honoring his dead sister's last wish, welcomed the Arian priest into the imperial court and gave him striking freedom of access. The man who had worked his way up through a grieving widow's household staff was now inside the palace. The moment Eusebius of Nicomedia and Theognis of Nicaea heard about this from exile, that a pro-Arian priest now had the emperor's ear, they wrote letters claiming to have repented of their opposition to Nicaea. Asked to be released, the bishops who received those letters found it convenient to believe them, or at least to act as if they did. They were released. They returned to Constantinople, and they used Constantia's priest as their entry point back into the palace. The anonymous historian is scathing. He calls their repentance feigned. They affirmed with word but not conduct that they accepted Nicaea. Within a short time, Eusebius of Nicomedia had become one of the most powerful ecclesiastical figures in the empire. He forged alliances with the Meletians, a schismatic Egyptian faction, and used them to manufacture accusations against Nicene bishops. Eustathius of Antioch, one of the key Orthodox voices from the council, was deposed and exiled in 330. Athanasius of Alexandria, Nicaea's most ferocious young defender, the man history would call Athanasius contra mundum. Athanasius against the world spent the next decades being exiled and recalled 5 times over. His first serious trouble with the Arian faction started around 330, right when Eusebius was consolidating his position. The Council of Tyre, in 335, convened under pressure from Eusebius, formally deposed Athanasius. He was exiled to Trier, in what is now Germany. Constantine died in 337. He was baptized on his deathbed by Eusebius of Nicomedia, the man Constantia had helped pull back from exile a decade earlier. The emperor who summoned Nicaea, who exiled Arius, who seemed to have settled the question permanently, died receiving his Christian initiation from an Arian bishop. Sit with that for a moment. That is not the story we tell about the Arian controversy. The version we tell: Nicaea happened, orthodoxy won, heresy was condemned, end of chapter. The version that actually happened was messier and more human and ran directly through one woman's grief. A widow living in her killer brother's court found comfort in a priest who offered her a story she wanted to believe that an innocent man had been unjustly condemned. She used the most significant political asset she had left, not to reclaim land or title, but to advocate for a theology she had come to find persuasive. She may have been wrong about Arius. From the perspective of Nicene orthodoxy, she clearly was. But she was not naive, and she was not simply manipulated. She had been navigating imperial politics since she was 18 years old. She attended Nicaea. She counseled the Arian bishops on how to survive it. She understood the stakes exactly. What Eutychius gave her wasn't just a flattering story. He gave her a framework that matched her actual experience of how power works, how official condemnations can be manufactured, how jealousy and politics can dress themselves as righteousness. She had watched that happen to her husband and son in real time. Her influence on Eusebius of Nicomedia predated all of this by years. The prominence Eusebius held at Licinius's court, which established him as a major figure before the controversy fully erupted, was largely attributable to Constantia. She was his patron before Nicaea. After Nicaea, she intervened to bring him back from exile, and her deathbed recommendation of Eutychius opened the palace doors that allowed Eusebius to undo, piece by piece, the political settlement Nicaea had produced. Eusebius died in 341 at the height of his power. He never saw Arianism defeated. That didn't happen until the Council of Constantinople in 381, under Theodosius I, more than 50 years after Nicaea. Constantia died around 330, before most of the consequences of her interventions had played out. She never saw Athanasius exiled. She never saw her brother baptized by the man she had helped rescue from exile. She never saw the decades of theological civil war that followed. What she created was a corridor, a way back in for people and ideas that had been officially shut out. She built it quietly, through personal relationships, through trust accumulated over a lifetime of surviving things that should have destroyed her. The anonymous historian who recorded her story blamed her for enabling heresy. The sources that mention Eutychius call him a flatterer, a schemer, a deceiver. But I keep going back to the scene at her deathbed, her brother at her side. The thing she's asking for, not land, not money, not the restoration of her dead son's title, but for Constantine to show mercy to a man she believed had been wronged. And then the last thing she does, the very last exchange she has with the most powerful man in the world, is vouch for a priest. As one who has experienced his uprightness, I recommend him to you. That professor I mentioned, with the tidy lecture and the 300 bishops, he wasn't lying. He was telling the public version. The private version ran through deathbeds and grieving households, and the kind of conversation you have with a sibling who holds your fate but still owes you something, because you stayed quiet when you could have spoken, and both of you know it. Christianity's most consequential theological dispute was not settled in a council hall. It kept breathing for another half-century because of how power actually works through relationships, through proximity, through one woman willing to spend her last breath on a cause she had decided to believe in. I still have that notebook from that lecture. Nicaea, 300 bishops, one emperor, one creed. I never wrote down what came after. Constantia found a story she wanted to believe, and that belief moved empires. But she's not the only one. The Bible itself contains a passage so dark, so deliberately ignored, that most pastors quietly skip past it every single time. It comes right after the flood, and once you read what it actually says out loud, you'll understand exactly why they do.